My name is Bryant. I'm 19 years old, and today I'm getting baptized. To those of you who have known me over the years, you might be surprised to learn that I wasn't baptized already. After all, I was born in the good Christian home. My dad helped start the church. My mom led the children's program, and my grandma taught Sunday school. If anyone was safe, it would have been me. But I wasn't. As a kid, I grew up around strong Christians, both in my family and in the church. I was given immense access to people who had a measurable and pronounced walk with God, and people who weren't afraid to share their walk, their life stories with me. Growing up with my dad, I knew all the right things about God, what he taught me, and going to Sunday school, my grandma would reinforce those truths through her own teaching. The only problem was, of all those truths about God, of all the things I was told he was, I refused to believe the most important one, that he loved me. Since kindergarten, I had developed an immense hatred for myself. I'd hurl insults at myself, throw punches at myself, say all sorts of horrible things about myself to myself and to everyone around me. I had come to believe as young as age 5 that I was a failure. I'd already messed up too much. I was already too far gone. My life was already over. As time went on, this belief began to solidify, and by the time I was 9, I made another decision, that I wouldn't be going to heaven. After all, why should I? I was a failure. I had done too many things. I was an idiot. I was useless. I was a waste of space. God couldn't love somebody like me, and if he did, he shouldn't. I deserved the worst punishment imaginable. And if I accepted Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, which I fully believed in, I would be skirting that punishment. I needed to go to hell. So I started living in rejection of Jesus' sacrifice and of God's love. Soon my outbursts would start to get more and more violent, but these outbursts were never towards anyone else. If I screamed, I was screaming at myself. If I was punching somebody, I was punching myself. If I was throwing something at somebody, that somebody was me. Not only had I convinced myself that I was the worst person in the world, I wanted everybody else around me to agree with me. So I had to prove how bad I was. I had to prove I was a failure. I don't think anyone was more hurt by my thinking out of all the people that I love and care about than my mom. I can only assume how painful it must be to see your child scream and hurl fists at himself, to say he's a failure, to say nobody loves him. That point must have hurt my mom the most, because she knew that was a lie. My mom loves me very deeply and always has, and even in the midst of my worst moments, she developed a drive to change my thinking, to get me to see myself the way she saw me, and most importantly, the way God saw me. Despite all her efforts and the efforts of many people around them, I refused to believe them. I refused to believe that there was any good in me, that I had any positive qualities. I was a failure. I was God's mistake. I deserved punishment, not God's grace. When you've convinced yourself so thoroughly of these things, these lies, it's not hard to see where this leads next. By the time I reached middle school, I'd begun to entertain suicidal thoughts. Fortunately, I never came close to acting fully on these thoughts, but that didn't stop them from looming over me. As middle school came and went, I lost most of my closest friends, and as I entered high school, where nobody knew me and nobody wanted to, I began to become seriously depressed, self-conscious, and anxious. I already held myself to my worst traits, and as I started to fail in some of my classes, I defined myself by those failures as well. I ignored the things I did do well in, chalking them up to coincidence or flukes, even going so far as to say that I hadn't actually succeeded in whatever the thing might be. Soon, my anger outbursts became mental breakdowns. Those occasional fists I'd throw would stop hitting my desk and start hitting my face, and it was becoming more and more obvious to me that I was alone in the world. Maverick youth was supposed to be my escape from all this, and while it did eventually become that, it didn't start out that way. I encountered many of the same social anxieties at Youth on Tuesday that I was having at school every other day of the week. Nobody knew me. Nobody seemed to care about me. Again, I was alone. And although I didn't want to go, something was different about Maverick, so I kept coming back. In 9th grade, I would join Maverick on their annual trip to Momentum Youth Conference. That week and the subsequent 2 Momentums I'd attend later would play a huge role in changing my life. The first night of the conference, Pastor Andrew gathered all of us high schoolers together in the hallway of the dorm we were staying in. I barely knew Andrew. I barely knew the other kids in the room. They were about to become the most important people in the world to me. It was in that narrow hallway, on that humid evening in rural Indiana, that I felt like I truly, genuinely belonged. Andrew had gathered us all in the room to talk about porn. He asked us to raise our hands if we had become addicted to it, and in that moment I wasn't sure what I was going to do. Surely nobody else had fallen into that trap. I was the worst person in the world. I was the only person who could do something so evil. And so I raised my hand. To my surprise, I wasn't the only one. In fact, of the 10 or so guys in the group, not one of them had their hand down. It was in that moment that God opened my eyes, and if only for that moment, to the fact that I wasn't the only broken person in the world. I left Momentum with a very different sense that I had been living with for the rest of my life prior. For the first time, I got the sense that God loved me, God knew me. For everything I was, every lie that I told, every mistake I made, every disappointment, He knew all that, and He loved me anyways. That sense that wouldn't stay with me for long as I left the spiritual highs of youth conference and back into the crushing lows of a high school where nobody knows you exist. It seems I was right back where I left off. The rest of my high school life would be dominated by this cycle of an overwhelming depression and a sense of self-hatred broken by a big spiritual event only to fall right back down into it. I'd begun to get comfortable in the life I was living. I had become too comfortable living in my rejection of Jesus' salvation, too comfortable living as a person consigned to failure. As COVID hit and a lot of the things I had taken for granted were stripped away, I was left with a lot of nothing. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly directionless. Plans I had set in motion were completely reversed. Friendships I had maintained for years violently upended. I had reached my breaking point. COVID forced a lot of changes in my life. It cut my high school experience short and, by extension, forced me to lean into being an adult a whole lot faster than I thought I was ready for. I spent most of 2020 at home, alone, and without a sense of direction, and an even more pronounced sense of failure. My mental state had ended up worse than it ever was. And now I had to go off and live on my own. Anxiety began to build as the move-in date for GCBI got closer and closer. I was surrounded by a lot of distractions that became addictions. By the time I did get to GCBI, the same mindset that followed me through high school continued. It all came to a head on September 26th, 2021. That was the day, after living in my self-hatred, living in my rejection of God's love, living in the rejection of who I really was, that was the day it all changed. It was just another evening. I was sitting on my computer doing nothing, when I should have been doing homework for GCBI. Then, like they usually did, those thoughts came swirling around my mind. Reminders of all my inadequacies, the painful moments of the friends I had lost, the constant feeling that I didn't belong here, that I wasn't good enough. I had to get away from it. I grabbed my jacket and ran upstairs and out the door. And for 2 hours, I walked the damp, cold streets of Milton, and I spent that time in prayer to God. I prayed about all the things I had done wrong, all the lies I told myself, the lies I told my family, my friends. For the first time verbally, I was recognizing that I was lying to myself. In that prayer, I laid out everything before Him, everything that I was going through, everything I had been going through for the past few years. I asked Him to forgive me. I asked to accept the forgiveness I had known the whole time that Jesus offered. I knew I couldn't run from it anymore. In between cries of desperation or cries of exaltation, thanks to God for the life He had given me, the life I was undeniably blessed with. Thanks for the God-fearing people that I had been surrounded with, who never gave up on me, that made this moment possible. The God who made Himself known to that socially awkward 9th grader that summer in 2017 had made Himself known to me yet again. In light of everything I had done, and the list had grown a lot since then, God still loved me. He knew before He even sent His Son to die for me all the ways I would let Him down, all the ways I would corrupt His perfect design, interrupt His flawless plans for my life, and yet Jesus still came. He died on the cross knowing exactly what kind of messed up person He was dying for. And He did want to know me after all. My life of rejection was over. In the brief 4 months since I made that decision, I have seen my life radically altered and changed in ways I can't possibly even begin to explain or even understand. I have a new confidence, a new hope, a new reason to live. I still make mistakes, I still mess up. In fact, I still do both as many times as I always did, but those mistakes no longer define who I am. My identity is no longer based on the lies I told myself, but is now found in the one who made me. I never thought I'd hear myself say the words, but I no longer hate myself. I want people to know how long a journey this has been, how difficult a journey this has been, and I want people to see that I have been transformed, not by anything that I've done, but by a God who loves me, a God who wasn't done with me when I was done with myself. This is true of me, but it's also true of anyone hearing this, whether they recognize it in themselves or not. I found myself at another pretty significant crossroads. I'm getting baptized now because not only do I believe that Jesus died for me, I finally accepted the implications of that for my own life. I'm getting baptized now to make clear to everybody that this decision was my own. That even though I'm going to keep messing up as I do it, I'm ready to make a defined commitment to live for Christ.